technically cemeteries were America's first public parks. The idea of like the rural cemetery, which is like Greenwood and Mount Auburn and these like really big, beautiful landscape cemeteries were created with the intention of having visitors. People would go on the weekends. They'd get out of like the gross cities that didn't have green spaces at the time.
Welcome to Wild Development Studio. Join us as we venture into the breathtaking realm of wildlife arts and untamed adventures. With captivating stories from the field and ideas to dive into the visual arts, we'll ignite your passion for conservation. Get ready to develop something wild.
Welcome to Wild Developments. I am your host, Lauren, and you're in the right place if you want a heartfelt connection with nature through visual arts and storytelling. Today, we're focusing on storytelling and creating in a different sort of way, through cooking and visiting cemeteries. I had a fascinating conversation with someone who does just that. It was eye-opening in being intentional with preserving your family's legacy and also talking about the nature spaces within cemeteries. Rosie Grant is a Master of Library and Information Science. She works part-time as a digital librarian at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, and full-time for outreach and communications manager for the Center for the Study of Women, Barbara Streisand Center in UCLA. She runs Ghostly Archive on TikTok and Instagram, where she discovers and cooks recipes she finds on gravestones and travels to visit them. Well, Rosie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, you certainly have a very unique way of spending time outside. You go to someone's grave to share their, let's call it their forever recipe and the recipe that they want to be known for. How did this all get started?
Well, it was a bit of a weird start, as I guess, since I was studying to be a librarian at the University of Maryland during the pandemic. And as part of the library science program, we needed to do an internship at like a library or an archive. And most places were closed, but I guess unsurprisingly, cemeteries were busier than ever, unfortunately, during the pandemic. So I got an internship in the archives of Congressional Cemetery in DC, which is this beautiful older cemetery. And basically during the class too, or, during this program, I started this class that was like how social media works and algorithms. So I had started a cemetery-based TikTok just because of that, where it was talking about things that were new to me and learning about that. And I was just posting about different memorials I was coming across. And that was how I've heard about the first gravestone recipe. So I cooked it, put it on TikTok, and kind of the rest is history.
Were you an avid baker and cook beforehand, or did you get started because of this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say I loved food and eating and like communal gatherings of food, but I hadn't really dedicated that much time to food myself, just like cooking and all of that. Just kind of like a lot of people, a lot of time opened up during the pandemic because we were home. And, I feel like for so many of us learning how to really dedicate time to cook, we could finally cook that dish that would take a while or, took a little bit of extra time and attention. And so a lot of these gravestones themselves are recipes that I never would have thought to make. Like I got an ice cream maker to make one. I got a cookie press to make another one. Learning different tips and techniques from relatives of these people. And so, yeah, I've definitely learned quite a lot from the process.
So you said you've worked with the archives. Is that how you find the recipe, or do you just go to a cemetery and start walking around and see what you see?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never found a recipe just kind of organically. Like I at this point now do go to quite a lot of cemeteries. But yeah, all of these recipes have been crowdsourced. So the first, I would say, maybe like 8 or so of them, I just learned through Google searches. I was on different blogs and websites and news alerts just because I was looking for just different interesting memorials in general. And now at this point, I've like honed in exclusively on gravestone recipes. And yeah, so most of them, like, one woman was featured in like a local news report when she passed away, and she just had such an interesting memorial that it had made local news. So like that popped up on a Google search. Atlas Obscura, which is just a really great resource for interesting things in different places, has a lot of cemetery content. So like they have done some storytelling around gravestone recipes of people in different places. So I got a few from them. And then once the project really started picking up, particularly on TikTok, I started hearing from relatives being like, oh my gosh, I thought my mom was the only one who did this. And so the rest have pretty much just been people sharing either they had come across it in their local cemetery or, yeah, someone's relative being like, my mom does this. Like, you should make her cheese dip.
Yeah, it was definitely, I didn't really know it was a thing until I came across your TikTok page. And so when you go and visit the headstone, you copy the recipe, you recreate, and you go and you enjoy that treat with them. Do you feel like you get to know that person when they were alive through what recipe they decided to share with the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely the research process has been very non-linear as with the rest of this. Of the almost now 30 gravestone recipes, I have visited 7 of them. And yeah, there's just something about going to a place, for most of these cemeteries, they were places either near where they grew up or their partner was buried there or they have other relatives there. And there a lot of them, I mean, there's one that's like in a large in New York City, but the rest of them have been kind of in these like smaller rural cemeteries around the country. And it says so much about like, they grew up in the town nearby or they had a summer home nearby and it was just a very special place to them. So yeah, the first 2 of them, which is a woman named Naomi, I made her Spritz cookies. And luckily for Naomi, so she was buried in Brooklyn, New York, very easy to get to. Spritz cookies, very easy to travel with. I go to New York. I was in DC, so very easy to access the area. And then the woman after that, Connie, buried just a few miles north, so very easy to go visit these 2 and bring them their recipes. Some of them have been, this kind of just was one of these things of like, oh, I just feel like if I'm going to go visit them or I'll be driving by, I might as well stop in and pay my respects. And bringing them their dish just kind of seemed like the thing to do of like people often leave flowers or mementos or coins, and the coins represent different things or stones. But I was like, and I will say, I never leave the dish at the grave, but like bringing it and having a moment with them does feel like, yeah, you're sitting down and like thinking about someone's memory and their legacy. So, yeah, in a weird way, it does feel like you get to know the person.
My Aunt Ruth makes my grandmother's cookies that she used to always make, and every Christmas she'll mail them to our family. And it's almost like for a second that we have our grandma back with us. Uh,
Oh,
and those moments are so important. And I love on your Instagram, you have pinned at the very top 8 questions to ask your family. And I wish that we would have done that for my other grandma. She made amazing meatballs.
oh.
What are some tips that you have for our listeners about how they can kind of keep that alive?
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, I'm so glad that your Aunt Ruth does that. Like, that's such a beautiful food tradition. And yeah, I think the pandemic really made, at least for my own family, aware of like interviewing grandparents and like writing down food legacies is so important. Both of my grandmothers passed away during the pandemic, and we really had this like moment of like, what's our food? Because like, we want to know your family history. This is a fairly standard genealogy practice of like interview your relatives while you can, get the names, the dates, the locations, like really important stuff. But something I hadn't thought about while I was interviewing my grandmothers was, yeah, our food legacies. Like, what were the things that your grandparents made for your parents when you were kids? What were the ingredients that they used? What was their technique? Have you made it with them? What was their dishes? Like, did they have a signature dish? Like we joke in our family on my mom's side, my grandma made all of us, like I have 32 like cousins and great grandkids and grandkids. Like there's a lot of us, and she made all of us this yellow cake, which is just a Duncan Hines box cake. But it's this like we all have that one recipe that's like, oh my gosh, that's my childhood, like, or that cookie dish or like meatballs. I can only imagine how good those were. But yeah, that's these things, if we don't write them down and preserve them, the recipes can very easily be lost. And they're so precious. And it's very much of like you don't know what you got till it's gone. Like we didn't realize how important these like food legacies were. And it is uncomfortable to talk about like, oh, we'll all die someday. Like we need to like write this stuff down now while we can. But at least with food, it's like, hey, I want to know how to make this dish. Like, and also in our family, we have this really famous chocolate pie that my aunt made. And luckily, she wrote it down for my mom and my aunt, and they've cooked it and have taught me and my cousins how to cook it. Cause like these are the things that I would want to teach my kids and like pass it down through the family. Cause if you don't take the time and effort, it can easily be lost.
Yeah, you got to be intentional with it for sure. You brought up
Exactly.
yellow cake and that it was, a box thing. Was reminded of that Friends episode where I think it was Monica figured out that Phoebe's grandma's famous cookie was actually Toll House or something like that. Have you ever come across that on somebody's gravestone that it was like a box recipe?
Gosh, that would have been amazing. These have all been, for the most part, yeah, the origin. So like I've been interviewing all the families now as I like get in touch with people. And so that is like the origin of the recipe is one of the questions that I asked them. For a few of them, it was either adapted from a cookbook. There's only one chocolate chip cookie recipe, and I think it's fairly different from the back of the Toll House recipe because I do feel like that's a story I hear quite a lot of like recipes being secret or secret family recipes. And I was like very curious about that because a lot of people go like, oh, my mom or my grandma would not share the secret family recipe. And then it turned out in the end, it was just because it was like the back of the box kind of thing. It was delicious, but it wasn't necessarily like the biggest secret, but it made it very fun and like personal for it to be that person's recipe. The closest though that there is one woman who it seems to be her recipe was adapted from a New York Times cooking like posts like in the newspaper. So they still have like a clipping of it. But it was a recipe that she never shared in life. So like her son would bring these cookies to like work gatherings and everyone would be like, "Can you share this recipe? These cookies are so good." And he'd be like, "She's not going to share it. Like this is her best kept secret." And on her deathbed, when they were thinking about her memorial, they were like, what represents you? What's your legacy? And everyone kept saying, "Well, these cookies are like they're really good cookies. Could we put your recipe on the gravestone?" So eventually she agreed to it. They got the recipe. But yeah, in the process, they realized it was pulled from this newspaper clipping that they still have. Uh, so it was a widely accessible recipe, but there's just something so special about like, well, this is her recipe now.
She's adopted it now.
Uh-huh, exactly.
Do you have any plans to make a book with the recipes that you've done?
Yeah, I'm working on one right now. It's such a funny thing because this whole started about 2 years ago. And when it was like 5 recipes, it was like, wow, who knew? Like 5 recipes, that's amazing. Kind of end of story. And then there were 10, and then there were 15, and then there were 20. And so now that we're entering into like almost 30, I'm like, wow, this is maybe enough for, yeah, for a book. And it would be definitely an unusual cookbook because it would be featuring the stories of who were these people that decided to do this. Like pretty much almost none of them were professional chefs. A few of them owned restaurants at one point in their lifetime, but their recipe, their like food legacy, and a lot of them have amazing stories from their relatives. So I've been working through that now of like getting permission to include their recipe, and then yeah, stories about who was this person behind this like amazing dish.
I love that. I'll be keeping an eye out for that.
Please, thank you.
What has been your favorite recipe that you've recreated?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question and one that I never have a good answer to. They've all been really good and very, very different. I'd say the ones that I make the most often, there's a Snickerdoodle cookie recipe, a woman named Annabelle who's buried in California. Really, I mean, I think Snickerdoodles, I like it so much because it's a cookie my mom made for me as a kid. So I'm very like nostalgically attached to it. It makes a million cookies. And the story behind it too, I just really love. So connecting with her daughter, she was saying that her mom, so the woman who had this recipe, was a volunteer firefighter. And this is in like Northern California where they have some pretty intense forest fires. And she just remembers over time of like in the middle of the night, all these people gathering in their house to like prepare to fight forest fires together, like all the volunteers. And she would make this batch of cookies to like feed all these people. Um, so just this idea of like these cookies literally having this like forest fire legacy. And like even then, like in much less dramatic situations, she would make these cookies all the time. This batch makes so many cookies. And like, the postman would come by, she'd give them cookies. The handyman would come by, give them cookies. It's just like continuously feeding people.
Aw, that is so sweet. I was gonna ask if you notice any themes. So Snickerdoodles one. Is there any
Mhm.
other themes?
Themes as far as just the
Like
like the
things that keep reoccurring.
oh yeah, that's a great question. I'd say like I mean there's two snickerdoodle. It's like funny with the like synchronicity that's happened with this. So like Yeah, there's two Snickerdoodle cookies that I learned about at different times. For about a year, people were commenting on TikTok, like, I think I've seen a carrot cake somewhere. And it was like post after post, people would be like, I feel like I've seen it somewhere. And I would message them being like, do you know where? Like, can we confirm that? And they'd be like, no, I don't remember. It happened a long time ago. Like, maybe it was here, maybe it was there. And then suddenly within 24 hours, I learned about two carrot cakes, like one after another, two different people, two different locations. And it was so funny that I like learned about them basically in one day. And because the first carrot cake came in and I was like, oh my gosh, that's the famous carrot cake. And then hours later, a second family reached out and they're like, oh, our mom does this. And I was like, there's two carrot cakes? Like, this is crazy. And then same for sugar cookies. I learned about them the same day. Another commonality is there's two women who are actually still alive that put up their gravestones. So the carrot cake being one of those people is still alive. And then there's a woman who has one of the sugar cookies. She's still alive too, and both are well. I've talked to both of them. And yeah, it's just such a funny thing of like, oh yeah, like some people put up their gravestones even before they pass.
I never even thought of that. Well, now I have to ask, many, many years from now, have you decided if you want to have a recipe on your headstone?
Yeah, I think at this point, I feel like I have to. But in the best of ways. I just think it's such a beautiful tradition. I've started talking to Congressional Cemetery, so the place where I interned at, and I would love to be buried there. And I mean, people. So I live in Los Angeles right now, right next to Hollywood Forever Cemetery, and Hollywood Forever is really interesting because some of the really cool gravestones are people still alive, and they just wanted to be buried there. It has so much history and just so much for the things for the living, like tours and whatnot. And there are a lot of these like very popular city cemeteries are running out of space. And so I think I'll be buying a plot if I can, just because I'm like, well, they're gonna run out of space in no time. So I might as well get in while I can. And I think I would put a clam linguine recipe on
Oh,
my favorite thing to make for like guests. It also isn't too many instructions that I feel like it would fit fairly easily onto an epitaph. That's always an interesting thing of like, how do people fit a full recipe? Like, either you definitely pay for it, like by the letter. Some people put little plaques on it, like plastic plaques, which I'm sure is you can just fit a lot more instructions onto it because it's
mhm.
typed out. But yeah, so I think I might do that if I had to pick something.
I would maybe do, I have a sweet potato casserole recipe that people have asked
Oh,
for. I've never shared it, but I might
oh.
consider.
I mean, the joke, well, they take it to the grave. A few
Mhm.
families have said that. They're like, we first said it as a joke of like, well, she took it to the grave, that recipe. And then they're like, but actually, that's a great idea.
These are great conversations to have because, when people talk about death, they're like, ew, ick, I don't want to talk, but like normalizing it and
Yeah.
you're helping to preserve your legacy and your family's legacy.
Exactly that. I think for myself, I was not aware of something called the death positive movement, which is this idea that people and society are better off if we do have these discussions about death and dying. And like, death positive is a very like kind of like tongue in cheek term because it's not like, yay, we'll all die someday, but it is like the more we accept our own mortality and have healthy conversations with our relatives of what do you want to be remembered for? Like, do you want to be buried in a cemetery? Do you want to be cremated? What do you want your funeral to be like? Do you want your ashes scattered in this or that? Like, oftentimes, like, we don't want to talk about it. And then, the thing happens that will happen no matter what. It's not like we're like, oh, like, if we don't talk about it, it'll never happen. Like, it does. And the family doesn't have to decide, like, what is important to this person? How did they want to be remembered? Like, having that decision already made and discussed just makes things so much easier. Death is such a taboo topic in the kind of like Western culture, anyways. And so, what I like about gravestone recipes is like it's an easier entry point to harder topics. You can say, like, I love this dish. Oh my gosh, you're known for that sweet potato pie. Like, that's awesome. Like, we can talk about that. And it's a little bit easier as like an entryway to being like, okay, what is your legacy in life? Like, as you would like to see it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I do want to ask too, because we've got in Cincinnati, it's called Spring Grove Cemetery, and it's very popular for birding because it's got lots of beautiful trees. And I went there not too long ago and it was a little uncomfortable just because I'm not sure of the etiquette.
Yeah.
And you stop and you look, and there's a lot of history there. What are
Yeah.
some tips that you might be able to share as
Yeah,
far as etiquette?
that's a great question about etiquette. I would say it is very cemetery dependent. I feel like so a lot of like obviously like smaller family owned plots, it would definitely be like by invitation and like welcomeness to like how the family feels about who owns the space. But I would definitely say for a public cemetery, especially like in a city like Cincinnati, and like again like in the cemetery that I entered at Congressional, a lot of cemeteries are noticing that like it's a very interesting business model of the idea that you are paying to be interned there in perpetuity. Gravestones do take work and preservation work and even like mowing the lawn, and it's just very expensive to do the upkeep for a cemetery, more than like a plot price would pay for. And so really bringing in the local community is a preservation method. It is truly getting people to care about the cemetery. I hadn't heard about birding, and that's such a great idea. I know there's a lot of like arborists and like horticulture groups that care a lot about cemeteries. Technically, cemeteries were America's first public parks. And so
Oh, wow.
yeah. So the idea of like the rural cemetery, which is like Greenwood and Mount Auburn and these like really big, beautiful landscape cemeteries were created with the intention of having visitors. People would go on the weekends, they'd get out of like the gross cities that didn't have green spaces at the time, and you would come in and enjoy your time there and you'd picnic there. And I think like the more the death industry has like disconnected us from grief and love, like the way that we're like, we don't experience the dead body as much as possible. So it has kind of created this like sort of like spooky and comfortability with going to cemeteries. Obviously you want to be respectful, but I would definitely say if a cemetery has public events that the cemetery is putting on themselves. So, if the cemetery themselves is hosting like a birding group or like a nature group or a historical tour, it's truly to help preserve the cemetery. The more a community cares about the cemetery itself, like Congressional definitely saw this. It used to be very disconnected from like visitors and having people come and stop by. And the cemetery was derelict. And when it comes to a cemetery being derelict, it becomes inactive. Eventually, at least in the case in DC, we've had a few bulldozed cemeteries that turned into shopping malls, which is very unfortunate. And so, like, that's the worst case scenario. Hopefully, most cemeteries don't have to deal with that, but it's a true like preservation issue. And so, yeah, if you go and visit, definitely see if there's like an official thing hosted by the cemetery. I always feel like for people who are uncomfortable, that's an easy entry point. Yeah, a lot of big cemetery in cities will do tours and events and classes. And it's just like a nice way to like come and like learn about, like, say the names, learn about the people who are there. Obviously, like, respect the rules. Most cemeteries have that posted anyways. And so it just makes it a little bit of an easier access point to it. But and then also like on the flip side too, when people like some of the comments I'll get is like, oh, I just think it's, disrespectful to go through if you're not visiting someone that sort of thing, which again, I totally understand that. And whatever people are comfortable with, like do what makes you feel comfortable. But like a phrase that I read recently that I keep thinking about in this process is like you die twice, like when you actually die. And the second time is the last time someone says your name. And this idea of a cemetery being this like memorial for someone of like, this is like where you read the name of people from the past and, remember them, think about them, wonder who they were. And like it keeps them alive in a way that I find really beautiful. So that's an extremely long answer.
That's
Like,
great.
get connected to your local cemetery. Like it will honestly help the cemetery out.
That's a great answer. And you reminded me of that movie. I think it's Coco, the Disney
Oh,
movie,
yes.
yeah, where they're keeping that memory alive.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Coco, I think about that's like my Roman Empire over the sake of like, oh my gosh, like remembering our people. And like Dia de los Muertos itself is such a beautiful tradition of like going to visit a loved one and having food at their gravesite and telling stories about them and keeping their memory alive. Like it's a much more in that tradition, much more accepted of like visiting and like celebrating and like remembering someone's life and legacy. Like yeah, I love that so much.
It was beautiful. And let's see, I'm trying to think of what I should ask you next. You
For
know,
yourself, so you have you I just I get so excited about these things. So for your experience with cemeteries, have you visited any in your local area? I know you mentioned birding, that sort of thing.
um, I did the Spring Grove Cemetery a couple weeks ago because I heard that there was a cedar waxwing there,
Oh,
which is a
interesting.
beautiful bird, and I've never seen one in person. Um, so that was probably my second or third experience in a cemetery, and then I've gone to visit my grandparents. They're buried in New Jersey, and we've
Oh,
done that once, or maybe twice. I can't remember, but it was, very solemn and obviously very sad.
yeah.
And yeah, I think the recipe is just such a great way to kind of soften the mood and remember
Yeah.
happy times.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. Man, New Jersey has so many beautiful cemeteries too. I feel like what we did recently for my grandparents was because, like, we were very traditional with all of them of just like it's their name and birth date and death date. Really, I think, yeah, no, that's about it. But we made the yellow cake and we brought it to my grandma's grave and we had a slice of it and we just kind of sat around and told stories about it. We are like, oh my gosh, remember when she did this thing? And my mom was even like, you know what? I never liked the yellow cake. It's so funny that this is like our whole thing. So we were just like chatting about yellow cake at grandma's gravesite. And like it made it so much easier having food is just it. I mean, it's such a comfort too. Like I've been reading about like funerary foods too. The reason why certain funeral foods get like pulled in because it's just like comforting and like it is something for the living to like kind of carry on and like hold on to a memory of someone. Like you smell the smells that you smelled together, you taste the things you tasted together. So not to say that a lot of people I think would be uncomfortable bringing food to a cemetery and having a bite, but for us, it made it a lot easier to like talk about the person.
It kind of gives you a reason to hang out there a little bit longer instead of just like, oh, saw it. Now, say a little
Check it off
prayer,
the list.
leave. Yeah.
Phoenix here. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah, understandably. I mean, even like as places of mourning, they're very interesting too. Like, I mean, obviously, like you have photographs, you have like your own tales, but there's something about going to a cemetery with like a public landmark to a person that I just find so fascinating. And like, especially a modern cemetery, there's so many different like personalized things that might come up on a gravestone. Like in congressional, there's people's like, sexual orientation is listed on gravestones, or their favorite book quote, or their favorite movie reference, or like even like an inside joke in the family. One person has like a call number to, I think, a book that they wrote in Library of Congress. And like, what, I don't know. It's just so cool to see like this is important to them. So they put it on the gravestone.
some of the things are funny. Like, isn't there somebody that has a quote that says, I told you I was sick or something like that? Like,
Yeah. So that's actually there's multiple people who have done that. And one of them is an NPR, one of the big NPR Scott Simon. So Scott Simon's dad is one of those people we did an interview about it and we were just chatting about memorials. And this was like the off-air part. He was just like mentioning the story. And he was like, I have to tell you what my dad wanted on his gravestone that we ended up doing was the I told you I was sick. And he was like, he was right. He was sick and like we would joke about it that he like didn't want to go to the doctor or something. And then when he was like on his deathbed, he was like, please put this on my gravestone. And they were like, okay.
that's
So
funny.
I just find that every time I listen to Scott Simon now on NPR, I'm like, your dad.
I've done a couple adventures with my husband where we were biking and it started snowing. And there
Oh,
have been times where I'm like, we're going to die, like being so dramatic. And I keep joking with him. I'm going to be like, I told you this time I was right.
yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. So the woman, the carrot cake one the woman in California who again has great carrot cake, but on the back side of her grave, so it's her and her husband. Again, both of them still alive, but they put up their gravestones together. And on the back side, it's his grave that says, I should have listened to my wife. And next to it on hers says, yeah, look where we ended up, which is so funny. Like and when I'd gotten a photo of this gravestone from someone who just lived in the neighborhood who was just like, oh, you should see this carrot cake. And in the message, they were like, you have to see the backside of these two gravestones. Like, it's so funny. And I think about that all the time.
So funny. Now, did I see on one of your TikToks recently, or maybe it might have been on Instagram, did you see a peacock in the
Yeah.
cemetery?
So if you ever come to Los Angeles, this is the cemetery I live next to, Hollywood Forever. By far, I've been to, at this point, maybe 200 or so cemeteries. I've never been to a cemetery like Hollywood Forever. They have a resident peacock colony that lives there. They have vets. They have this whole, I think peacocks, like some attendant brought one at one point, and then they just, people, grievers were really happy to see them. I think peacocks represent some sort of like, eternity type message. But yeah, there's like 40 peacocks that fully live there. They walk around the cemetery. They just stay on the grounds. They're beautiful. And then, they have like this little peacock, like stained glass at one point in one of the areas. They have a cat colony that also is like all of these cats that live on the cemetery premises. They have a vet that comes in and takes care of them. And it's very strange. I think on the cats, at least, they take care of like local rodent issues. And yeah, I think people who have been, are going to visit someone or are mourning, like there's something that's very like, wow, this is so beautiful. Like this little like kitty cat lives nearby, and these peacocks like kind of roam around the area that keeps the cemetery very lively. It's definitely the craziest cemetery. Between like all the celebrities buried there, they do movie nights, they do concerts, they have a full concert hall.
Wow.
Yeah, they have like, yeah, historical tours, they have events there. They have, I think, one of the America's largest Dia de los Muertos festivals, like really, really cool stuff pretty much every day of the week.
Wow. I'm gonna have to visit next time I'm out that area.
Yeah. Yeah, hit me up. Like I said, I live right next to
Nice,
it.
I will. So I'm pretty spiritual and I definitely believe in signs from our loved ones. Have you ever, when you're in a cemetery, I think, that could be a pretty active place. Have you ever yourself felt any signs or seen anything?
I haven't seen anything. I would say though, because I feel very similar. Like I love the idea of like someone moving on to a good place. And like I think the way that I think of it when I go and I have like a cookie or a bite when I'm sitting at the graveside is like I imagine like I've seen usually by the time I've gotten there, I've like researched this person or I've talked to their relatives, like I have information. I usually have a photo of them. And it helps to kind of imagine that they're there with me and we're like sharing a bite of their thing, because that's probably what they would have done in real life of like, they pull the cookies out of the oven, you sit down and you have a conversation. The one that I think about the most frequently is there's a woman named Marion who's buried in Maine, and she has an ice cream recipe on hers. And I visited her last summer, and it was like the craziest fluke of events. There was these like flash floods. Maine in the summer is normally like quite beautiful. It doesn't rain that much, at least since like I've started going. My partner's from Maine, so we go every year. But it was flash floods. I'd rented a car for the day. I was like, oh, I have to go see her right now. But it was like torrentially raining and there's no grocery store. She's in the middle of like nowhere. That's like an hour away from like the closest grocery store. And so I had like picked up ice cream at one place that like Matt, because I was like, I can't bring a tub of an ice cream maker through TSA. Unfortunately. So I was like, oh, I'll just buy like, it's a vanilla based ice cream. I bought a vanilla bean ice cream, and she mixes this like apricot and nutmeg mixture into it. And so I like made it in the car, torrentially raining, and it was just like so chaotic to get there. My phone died at one point. It was just like a lot going on. But I remember sitting, I was like, well, I've come all this way. I might as well just like sit with her and like have a bite of ice cream in the pouring rain. And I had like my umbrella, and I was just like sitting there, and I felt this moment of like calm being when I like got next to her, and I was like, like, how are you, Marion? Like, this is so funny that like, this whole thing, I don't think you would have expected like your ice cream to be out here in these circumstances, but it was really sweet. It felt like I felt very like physically calm considering everything going on around. And I just felt like good eating ice cream and just like thinking about this woman who loved cooking, and like, her summer home was in Maine. And I learned later on it was just around the corner from there, this house that she had made her ice cream in. And yeah, I mean, I think that was the closest to like a spiritual thing of like, normally I think I would have been so anxious and like focused on everything else but being there with her. And the feeling of like calm and just like I felt just like very much at peace while eating ice cream with her. And like even her on her grave, the grave recipe is called her heavenly ice cream. And I asked her family, I was like, where did the heavenly come from? And they were like, well, she's in heaven now. So there's nothing more to it than that. But I was like, oh no, but I like felt very at peace when I was like with her. So yeah, I would say like definitely as far as signs, like even like some of like the randomness of how relatives got connected, like doing a random like news interview or podcast in these like different places will bring on someone who heard about it and then we'll reach out. And so in any case, yeah, I love that.
That's awesome. I hope you keep doing this for a long, long time. And how can people find you if they're interested in learning more?
Yeah, they can follow me on TikTok or Instagram at Ghostly Archive. If people have gravestones, recipe or otherwise, that they just find interesting or beautiful or cool memorials, feel free to reach out. If they have even a recipe in their family that they really are excited for people to try, they're welcome to send that too. I'm here for it all.
Great. And before we go, can you tell us one tip that you would have for someone who would like to connect with nature?
I would say, I mean, obviously I have to do the cemetery side of it. Cemeteries are, yeah, America's first public parks. And so find a public cemetery near you. You can even research the trees that are at it and do a nature walk through it. There's such peaceful places. I mean, like there's so much, I could feel like I could start a whole TikTok channel about trees that grow in cemeteries. It's just, they're the most beautiful spaces and they're cultivated for people to come and enjoy them and like just be in that space.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Rosie. And until next time, get outside and see what develops.
Thanks for joining Wild Development Studio. We hope this exploration into the world of wildlife arts and adventure has sparked a desire to get outside and connect with something wild. If you have an adventure that's awe-inspiring, don't hesitate to share. Click the link in the description to submit your story to have it featured on our show or be a guest. Until next time, keep connecting to the wild and see what develops. The views, opinions, and statements expressed by individuals during Wild Development Studio productions do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Wild Development Studio or its affiliates. Participation in any activities, expeditions, or adventures discussed or promoted during our content may involve inherent risks. It is strongly advised that individuals conduct thorough research, seek professional guidance, and take all necessary precautions before engaging in any such activities. Wild Development Studio, its representatives, or employees shall not be held responsible for any injury, loss, damage, accident, or unforeseen incident that may occur as a result of participating in activities inspired by or discussed in our content. By choosing to engage with our content or act upon any information provided, individuals do so at their own risk and discretion.